guess this isn't.
Of the free, and you'll know us by the trail of dead. It's just one more world war to complete the set. When you live by the pike, you die by the pith. You die wide-eyed, still pleading the fifth, or crying divine epithets and pathetic attempts at defense. All empathetic for those on your side of the fence. Well, I'll gladly put you and your legacy into an alternate tense of faltering senses and altered events. Like hun, it ain't a hearse, it's a reaper's stretch. Ah, how sweet, she said. Bunch of hordes in the street like it's Evil Dead. Where the thin blue line meets razor's edge. And where the corporate ladder ascends to a steel-toed boot that awaits on the ledge. You'll be licking it fresh at your boss's request till it stomps each finger and watches you fall to your death. And drown in an ocean of debt. Gone with the fodder who gathered to honor the patient left, who purity tested themselves into sections, step by step, till the next election, when it's just one them and the sound of their well-read theorized breath. That's harm reduction for the lowly cost of you holding your nose and just openly buying the theft. Maybe that's all in the flick of the pen. Maybe we're all one unmarked van from a trip to the pen. Being guarded by pigs who exist on a diet of dying breaths of much worthier men. Honey, heaven's expecting you. Just don't get too hung up on who they let in. Just look up at the shine of the pearly gates. You don't need to worry if there's lead in the paint. You don't need to worry if there's lead in the water, lead in the milk, lead in the honey, lead in the caustic embrace of the Heavenly Father. Lead is the flavor of passive perpetual slaughter. Lead is the taste of us led to the ledge by the lure of the legend of expert consensus, and then beckon to stretch it just one step farther. And I hope all the folks who were boastfully gloating and toasting themselves as the heroes of COVID for boosting their boosters and doing their part are now equally thrilled to be starstruck martyrs. All laid in a government grave with anonymous markers, like you're back from the carvers and off to the splicer. You're the very first wave to be slain in the war against Pfizer. That 100 years war against Pfizer. They are thinning the crowd that is striking right now to bleed adequate pay from those inhuman misers, who all sit in their office and designate coffins to people regarded as nothing but profit for Kaiser. Still the Dems want you nicer. Dems want you softer. Dems want you kinder. Yeah, they all want you graciously starving in silence. You will speak when you're spoken to. Rest of the time, you and all of us peasants are merely depressing statistics neglected in Congress's binders. All bled, bone dry, then fed to the grinder. Our headstones line each step as reminders. That's a lesson in object permanence learned in the furnace by workers consigned to the fire. Workers bled, bone dry, then fed by the fed to the grinder. Fed by the fed to the grinder. Now the Fed went straight to your head. Mind what you hide in your sighs unsaid, and your eyes turn blind to the signs unread. Flag bright red, so you let it in bed. You let it inside, and you'll see that it's fed. Never you mind that it grinds your wealth into bread for itself, then it bleeds you dry, then it dines on the dead. Now the Fed went straight to your head. Mind what you hide in your sighs unsaid, and your eyes turn blind to the signs unread. Flag bright red, so you let it in bed. You let it inside, and you'll see that it's fed. Never you mind that it grinds your wealth into bread for itself, then it bleeds you dry, then it dines on the dead. And the Fed went straight to your head. Mind what you hide in your sighs unsaid, and your eyes turn blind to the signs unread. Flag bright red, so you let it in bed. You let it inside, you'll see that it's fed. Never you mind that it grinds your wealth into bread for itself, bleeds you dry, then dines on the dead. The Fed pen went straight to your head. Mind what you hide and your sighs unsaid, and your eyes turn blind to the signs unread. Flag bright red, so you let it in bed. You'll let it inside and you'll see that it's fed. Never you mind that it grinds your wealth into bread for itself, then it bleeds you dry, then it dines on the dead. Here's where our leaders would see us all led. Here's where our leaders would see us all led. Here's where our leaders would see us all led. Here's where our leaders would see us all led. The pen went straight to your head. Mind what you hide and your sighs unsaid, and your eyes turn blind to the signs unread. Flag bright red, so you let it in bed. You let it inside, you'll see that it's fed. Never you'll mind that it grinds your wealth into bread for itself, then it bleeds you dry, then it dies on the dead. Pen went straight to your head. Mind what you hide and your sighs unsaid, and your eyes turn blind to the signs unread. Flag bright red, so you let it in bed. You let it inside, you'll see that it's fed. Never you'll mind that it grinds your mind, that it grinds yourself, that it bleeds you dry, that it dies on the dead. Here's where our leaders would see us all led.
Legend says that Hercules swept Cerberus right off his feet and effortlessly set him down softly as a songbird. Atlas kept the world upon his back and every day wondered whether he could stand it any longer. And TheTaraReade came out to say the man they tried to label the Messiah of morality was really just another rapist. And I don't intend to hesitate when asked who was the stronger. Tara, like Assange, knew that carrying the truth would be the hardest labor. Tara knew that her assailant wasn't gonna make us any safer, and knew he's just the type of man to hand a decent foreign leader US printed walking papers, and knew he'd be relentless and aggressive in the war he'd wage upon her very character, that his attempts to weaken and degrade and embarrass her would be her only compensation. But I strongly doubt that anyone could ever have foreseen the stream of hate that came from quote-unquote progressives and the self-styled titans of survivor advocation. So if you really think there's something to be gained out of sharing your pain with the world, you are sorely mistaken. The Biden team just dragged their feet addressing Tara's allegations. Until they had a decent list of smears, then they aired them out on every station. And it turns out no one wants to hear the truth of who they praised as being worthy of such bloated liberal celebration. That no one wants to really know the person they've so valiantly defended, even when it meant they had to gloat and shit all over someone braver than they'd be if given the occasion. Now cue the faceless comment squad invasion. Cue those fuckers crawling out the woodwork to come analyze the way you wore your hair and what you wear. Like your appearance waives your rights, or that somehow you're the reason for your situation. Somehow they've decided you should bear responsibility for what such monstrous men insist on doing. Somehow they're deluded by the empty, hypocritical, and useless fucking platitudes that bastard keeps on spewing. And I think it's very telling that the best of their excuses when they try to come and justify our president's abuses is a hearty butt Trump. In which case I'll remind you that you never saw the news attempt to sell us Donald Trump like he was morally upstanding or a decent human. But when Joe says something bigoted or ogles someone's little kid, CNN says, isn't this refreshing? Biden's like a mix of JFK and FDR with all the finer parts of Harry Truman. Christ, I know that they don't think that we're the brightest, but at least pretend we got a couple lumens. Ask yourself if you have ever questioned what they fed you, or do you just shut your eyes and then consume it? And now ask yourself if you ate every one of Biden's lies under guise of harm reduction and the promise of a slight improvement.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Politics of Survival. I'm your host, TheTaraReade, and wow, what a couple weeks it's been. We've had some wild rides in the news. So I want to start out because we have a very special guest with us today, and I know many of you are already on social media waiting and in the chat box with questions. So I'll get right to it. But before I do, I want to kind of introduce the subject matter that we're talking about. As many of you are aware, there is a young 21-year-old National Airman, Guardsman from Massachusetts, who has been charged now as of Friday with the Espionage Act and several other counts for releasing documents, leaked documents for the Pentagon. And these documents, the subject matter of them are quite astounding. And for many of us, we knew there's a lot of lies around this proxy war the U.S. and NATO is fighting via Ukraine against Russia. Many of us know that. But these documents really revealed a lot, lying about the numbers of casualties, lying about the way the money's being handled. There's also been some embezzlement. And the documents showed many things. Also, that the U.S. has been spying on allies. And there is other revelations. But rather than the media focusing on those revelations and the substance of these leaks, they're going full board helping the intelligence community catch the whistleblower, and also working with an organization called Bellingcat. And we'll get into that when we talk to Ray, but in the show. But this movement that we have towards media colluding with the intelligence community in censorship, in controlling the narrative, and now with going after this 21-year-old, when you're faced with the Espionage Act, as many of you know, it's very, very serious. And this young man could end up with decades in prison. And it's what Julian Assange is facing, up to 175 years, and he's not even a U.S. citizen, for simply publishing the truth. Now, we're going to analyze all of this, but first I wanted to show a brief clip of Tucker Carlson and Glenn Greenwald, the investigative journalist that did a documentary and was also portrayed in the film Snowden, when he worked with the case of Edward Snowden, who was a CIA analyst that whistleblew and did leave the country after he was going to be charged with espionage. But he revealed how the U.S. government was engaging in mass surveillance. Julian Assange revealed many war crimes, including the coup in 2014 of Ukraine, which now you bring us up to history, at this point of history, and we're in this, NATO-backed proxy war against Russia. So I wanted to show this clip as they're talking about the media collusion with intelligence and how it's changed, and then we'll go in deeper with our guest. So here's the clip. And Reef, could you play it out for us?
Personal. He's the host of System Update on Rumble. He broke, of course, the most famous leaking story in American history, the story of Ed Snowden. He joins us tonight. Glenn, thanks so much for coming on. I should say, and I'll just be quiet and let you speak since you know this better than anyone, but we left out a lot of details that are being reported in the Washington Post, the New York Times, et cetera, tonight about the leaker and where this all came from, because honestly, I don't believe anything, and it's very hard to know what's true. We're all being spun, we're all being lied to, and we just didn't want to repeat the lies. So with that, what do you make of this?
I can't think of an incident, Tucker, that reveals more vividly the real function of our nation's largest media corporations than what just happened here. If you're a real journalist, somebody who's devoted to transparency, shining a light on the most powerful government actors when they lie to the American people and informing the public, you would be celebrating this person who stepped forward and risked his security to show his fellow citizens that the government was lying about this incredibly important war with a nuclear armed power, that we have actual troops deployed on the ground in Ukraine. There's going to be no diplomatic resolution through at least 2023, that Zelensky is planning on using our weapons to strike deep into Russia, which we were told would never happen, risking escalation. He did the job of what journalists claim to do, which is show the public the truth. If you work for the intelligence agencies, you would be furious at this person. You would hate him because he revealed that you just lied. He exposed the truth about what you were doing. What's amazing is the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the people who were at that Pentagon briefing today think the way the CIA and the Pentagon think. They hate this person. It was the New York Times and the Washington Post that did the FBI's work and found the leaker and led the FBI to him. They're demanding that he be punished. They're demanding that the government clamp down and keep things more and more secret. What kind of journalist would ever do that, would want to see a leaker exposed and punished and then demand that the government keep even more secret? But that is what these media corporations are there to do. They love leaks when the CIA and Homeland Security tell them to leak. That's when they disseminate propaganda in the public, like they did during the Trump years when they leaked the transcript between Michael Flynn and Ambassador Kislyak, the most serious kind of leaking crime. The Washington Post did that. Nobody looked for that leaker. Nobody cared. Everybody cheered because it served the interests of the security state. But when it comes to transparency that undermines the agenda of these agencies and that proves to the American people what the truth is, it's amazing that these journalists are on the side of the government and will actually hunt down the leaker and demand that he be punished even more.
Okay,
I just don't understand.
Thank you. So with that, I want to introduce someone who's actually a legend, who I have a great deal of respect for and just spoke at the UN Security Council about many things, and I'll let him describe his time there. But he is a former CIA whistleblower himself. And as a former CIA member of the intelligence community that left it and started another organization. So I wanted to proudly introduce Ray McGovern. Ray, thank you for coming.
You're most welcome, Tara. You'll have to forgive me for being a little hoarse here. I've got a head cold that just won't quit.
I'm so sorry. Well, I hope you get better. And I'm just so honored to have you on the show. And I wanted to, you and I spoke on the phone a couple of times in the last couple of weeks. You were on the Kim Iverson show, and I really appreciate you doing that interview. We had just aired that last Friday. And since then, this whole Pentagon leaking thing has happened, and there's been, the documents floating around. It came from a gaming website called Discord. What are your thoughts on a 21-year-old F3 ranking, getting a hold of top secret documents? It looked like he was a cyber journeyman, but other than that, it's kind of unclear how he got those documents, and they were floating around for like a month. So what are your thoughts on it?
Well, to be a little flippant here, he was no just regular airman. He was an airman first class, right?
Mm-hmm. He was promoted last July.
How he got access to all this stuff is really a big question. Everyone is trying to look at the role of the media here and try to figure out who did what, who shot John. Investigative reporters like Glenn Greenwald are really good doing detective work. But I have to say that there's a very big story here that has not really been elucidated. And I may be wrong in interpreting these things this way, and it wouldn't be the first time I was wrong. But here's my take. What's important here is the facts are out, the unimpeachable official facts. Ukraine is losing. Russia is winning. The spring offensive that everyone was waiting for with bated breath may not come for, well, till the summer, or maybe next year. It's not going to happen, okay? So the story that has been given to the public is just 180 degrees opposite that. Ukraine is winning. Russia's forces have been degraded. They're going to run out of ammunition. I mean, I think, well, I don't know whether the intelligence people really believe the stuff that they have been putting out with journalists and apparently briefing the president on. For example, just a couple of months ago, April Haynes, she's nominally Bill Burns' boss. She's the director of national intelligence. She sits above CIA, NSA, DIA, all those are three-letter words. She said, you know, when spring comes, everything's going to be really good. I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to go forward. Russia is running out of ammunition. They don't have the factories to produce what they need. It's going to be really bad for Russia. And besides China, well, China's playing it pretty cagey. They're not putting their weight down on either side of this imbroglio. Well, I mean, nothing, Tara, nothing could be farther from the truth. China and Russia are now joined at the hip. I think the Chinese defense minister is Moscow now. They're preparing contingency plans to see what happens in Ukraine and see what happens vis-a-vis Taiwan. So what comes out of these documents is that we've been sold a bill of goods, and even our top intelligence advisors have been misleading not only us, but probably the president. What's the bottom line? Well, the bottom line is that Ukraine can't mount a decent counteroffensive this spring. They're losing. What the real situation is that the Russians are ready, once they clear out some of these places like Bakhmut, to go all the way west to the Dnieper River.
So, you know, as we look at this, kind of the grinding, the meat grinder, they call it, of Ukrainians being used basically as cannon fodder while NATO is fighting this proxy war against Russia and the US. It's US funded. One thing that's been really remarkable for this war is that usually the usual voices that are anti-war that you would expect, those progressive voices, those other voices that would be saying no war and calling out criticism for it, they're silent, or they're voting for it. Like you had AOC and some of those progressives, Bernie Sanders, that voted for more weapons going to Ukraine. So now we've spent $114 billion towards this. In my opinion, it's a money laundering scheme that will be revealed at some point, and already there's, you know, things indicating that. Definitely the weapons manufacturers are getting what they need out of it profit-wise. But what's remarkable is the way that in those press rooms, in those rooms, like for instance, when John Kirby was announcing about the leaks, saying that the media shouldn't report on them, the media complied. Fox News, CNN, New York Times even put in their article that they have not revealed some of the documents that were top secret. Well, then if they're top secret, then how do they have them? Yeah. So I guess because you've been doing this for a while, how has the media changed in your eyes in your lifetime from when you were coming forward and blowing the whistle to now?
Well, the media is joined with the government at the hip. There's nothing that the New York Times or the Washington Post will print that's really a bombshell without checking with the White House or the Pentagon. That's not an overstatement. And therein lies a real important point. In past situations of this kind, the New York Times, Washington Post have been able to suppress this information, not tell the story. Okay. I'll give you an example, Tara.
Okay.
in December 5th of 2017, okay, the head of the cyber firm that was supposed to do the forensics on the DNC computers and find out how the Russians exfiltrated all that stuff. He was put under oath. And what did he say? He said, there is no evidence, no technical evidence that anyone exfiltrated those emails out of the DNC, not the Russians, not anybody else. Now, I remind you, December 5th, 2017. You do the math. Do Americans know that? No, they don't. Could they know it? Well, yeah. Trump's people forced that into broad daylight by making Adam Schiff of the House Intelligence Committee publish that on May 10, 2020. Oh, no one took any note. Still, the New York Times didn't publish on that. The New York Times have kept that suppressed for longer than Adam Schiff did. So what I'm saying here is an important point, I think, namely that the New York Times always has the option of just putting this down. That's just a bunch of crazy kids on a couple of computers.
Right.
But this time they didn't. Is it possible that they did this without government approval? No. Oh, okay. What does that mean? In my view, that means that given the damaging facts, official facts in these leaks, somebody in position of some importance in the administration told the New York Times, go ahead and publish it. We have to get this damn war ended. Maybe if the Americans see how much they've been lied to by our major leaders, maybe this will bring an end to it. My reconstruction of how this happened is precisely that. Now, whether it was this airman first class or not, who knows? There'll be a lot of detective work done on that. There's at least one or a couple of documents that look like they came straight out of the CIA Operations Center.
Yeah, I have a question about that. Could you talk a minute, just a second, to explain to the audience, like some of those documents were gold. They look like originals. They're not copies. Okay, you're not looking at copies. You're looking at original documents, cables, whatever. Now, he was a cyber journeyman, which means that he would have access, right? Maybe if he hacked, I don't know. Like he was E3, which that ranking, it's Fort Bragg is where he was working out of. These are Pentagon documents that look like they came straight from a meeting, but they're kind of like all different subject matters. What is your thought about how someone of that ranking could get access to those?
It's a mystery, and that's why I say that I applaud people doing the detective work on this. Whether he acted alone, how he got access to CIA internal use only documents that, in my view, seldom, if ever, leave the CIA Operations Center. Yeah. It raises lots of questions. But I've been listening to people do all this detective work and also complaining about the media handling of this. And I have to say that that's, of course, appropriate, but they're missing the forest for the trees.
Okay. What's the forest through the trees?
The forest is, the truth is out there. Ukraine can't possibly win this war. There's one Defense Intelligence Agency analysis that says, this thing's going to drag on into 2024.
Right.
And nobody's gonna win. Another one says, well, there may be progress in the spring offensive. They may go as far as 20 miles. I mean, the thing is damning. And in one sense, to the degree that people focus on the provenance of this thing, who did it and how did this guy and all that kind of stuff, they're missing the big picture. What I'm thinking here is that people like Tucker Carlson, you had him on there interviewing Glenn Greenwald. Now, that must have been 2 days ago?
A day ago.
A day ago, okay. Well, yesterday, at least I think it was yesterday, Tucker Carlson had a really damning 10-minute program.
Yes.
The title,
it was the same program, yeah.
This is going to make you sick. Okay? And it almost made me sick, and I've seen a lot of this stuff in my years, okay? So I was thinking back, if you got this color hair, you've been around a while, it can be an advantage. If you're around for Vietnam, for example.
Right.
Well, no, what I'm saying when I say, is Tucker Carlson the new Walter Cronkite? Okay, all you bloomers, you can be forgiven.
Well, and as a matter of fact, Ray, we have your article up. Reef just showed it, and people, if they want to read it, can find you on Substack. Is that right?
Not on Substack, no, on my
no, on Ray, just on your website. All right, we have your website down in the notes, so we'll make sure if people want to click on it, they can.
Yeah, what I'm saying here is that to understand what I say, Tucker Carlson may be this year's or this war's Walter Cronkite. Yes, and you can see it if you Google Walter Cronkite. It was really quite a memory that I raised in doing that.
Yeah.
Walter Cronkite was the most respected journalist that America had during the Vietnam years. Not saying too much, actually. Very well respected, okay? Now, what happened? There was a countrywide offensive in South Vietnam with all the armed insurgents attacking every hamlet, village, town, province, and city. At the end of January, at the beginning of February, 1968, okay? It was called Tet Offensive, T-E-T, because it happened during the Tet season there in South Vietnam. It took everyone completely by surprise because they attacked with 600,000 men. And guess what? General Westmoreland was keeping the number of enemy down to 299,000 Viet Cong under arms. So half that. So the duplicity came out. It really hit the fan after Tet. And as I say, Tet ended early February 1968. Walter Cronkite, at the end of February, says, we've done what we could in Vietnam. The only solution is to negotiate and get out of there. Whoa, that was big, okay? Now, here's Tucker Carlson, a couple other people, well, Tucker especially, on this thing that's titled, This Will Make You Sick. He's saying, look, you've been lied to. These are facts. He adduces some of the facts. And he says, now, get a grip, American people. A lot of you watch me. Millions, I think. You need to do something about this so that more people don't get killed. It's important not to kill more people, right? Now, I don't agree with Tucker on many things, domestic policy especially, but on this, he's dead right. So the question is whether he and perhaps others could turn this thing around by informing the American people, look, this is a fool's errand, and we ought to get out of there because, well, for lots of reasons, one being getting involved in a conflict, an armed conflict with Russia, whether it's proxy or not, is very, very dangerous.
You know, in a lot of the work that you did, and you were able to establish, your foundation, could you, we have people that are in the chat that want to ask questions, but before they do, I just wanted to have you talk a little bit about what it was like for you to come forward at that time, and then the organization that you founded as a result.
Oh, thanks, Tara. Yeah, a lot of people ask me when I like St. Paul, when I fell off my horse, when I told the light about the mask.
Maybe in my view, you got on a horse and rode to as a hero. So depends on your perspective.
Yeah, actually, it's not a really good analogy to what happened. People don't know that Truman, who set up the CIA, set it up for one primary purpose, and that was he wanted one organization responsive to him alone, not to the Pentagon or not to the State Department, to whom he could go and say, I want you to tell me straight what's going on here in Russia, what's going on here in China, okay? I control your career. Give it to me straight. Whoa. Truman talked about untreated intelligence. That's what he wanted. No values attached to it. He wanted to know what was going on in the world. That's what attracted me to working in the CIA. That was the analysis division. Now, after the war, Tara, this would be kind of interesting for you to know, perhaps. The war, I was alive during the war. I was quite little. But after World War II, these very, very brave, courageous, and just really enterprising people came back from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA. They had jumped in behind enemy lines. They had overthrown governments. They had done all kinds of really, really sexy things. And they came and everybody in Washington clapped. And then they said, thanks very much. You want us to stay around? I mean, you got work for us? Now, the muckety mucks in those days, George Kennan among them, said, of course, stay around. Don't go back to your universities or your law firms or your corporations. No, stay here, because the Russians are doing all kinds of stuff. They are overthrowing governments. They are assassinating people. They are doing all kinds. We have to be able to do that too. Okay, so they're going to stay around. Then the question came, where do we put these guys? I mean, like, we can't have an agency for overthrowing governments or even for regime change. Oh, I know what to do. We'll put them together with the analyst division in CIA, and it'll be just one happy family, because the analyst division will have spies telling them information that they need to do analysis with. The covert action people will do all kinds of other stuff, but they'll be under one head, and they'll be just really great. It was a big, well, it was a structural fault from the beginning. You can't have one person being responsible for overthrowing governments and and that same person being responsible for telling the president, hey, Mr. President, this is a stupid idea. You don't overthrow this government because this, and this is going to happen. Or you don't blow up this pipeline, Mr. President, because this, and this is going to happen. So what I'm saying here is there are two CIAs. The one I worked in, especially on the Soviet account, I have a graduate degree in Russian studies, used to teach Russian. We were able to pretty much tell it like it was, like it is, until Bill Casey and Bobby Gates came in, early 80s. Then the Soviet analysis went down too. But during the period from 1963, when I entered the agency, I was able to tell it like it is to my briefies when I was briefing the President's Daily Brief downtown for the first 4 years of the Reagan administration. President's Daily Brief. So it was really good duty, and we could tell it like it was. And now it's kind of, now it's corrupted. So the long answer to your question is, when I retired as early as I could. It was early 1990. The Berlin Wall had just fallen down. George H.W. Bush was saying, look, why can't we just get along here? Let's get along with Russia. Let's create a strategic situation where we'll have peace and prosperity from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Oh man, I thought that was so great. All the more so since I had briefed Vice President Bush every other morning and had worked for him when he was head of the CIA. I patted myself on the back and said, Ray, the Soviet Union has fallen apart. You can go in peace to work downtown. I wanted to work downtown in a nonprofit that I had been volunteering with. So that was 1990. And then all of a sudden, 1998, 1999, and 2000, when Bush comes in, the small Bush, the little Bush, Junior Bush, all of a sudden,
George W.
My former colleagues falsifying intelligence to justify a war of aggression. I mean, it doesn't get any worse than that, okay? So a few of my colleagues thought, as I did, that, you know, this can't, we got to do something. We have the expertise. We have a fancy new way to communicate. It's called something like email or so, you know, and we can give each other sanity checks. When I write something that says Vice President Cheney is lying through his teeth, you know, I like to, you can't go to the next cubicle anymore and get your, what you could do, email, right?
Right.
So what happened was we formed our little group called the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, okay? Sanity, of which there was not an abundance in Washington at the time, and sanity to remind ourselves that, you know, we got to give each other sanity checks. We think we know what's going on, but the collective expertise of this collegial body can tell the president better than just one individual. And we wrote our first memo on the very afternoon, right after Colin Powell spoke at the UN, 5 February 2003. And we told the president, this is a lot of what the British call rubbish. It certainly doesn't justify a war. I remember our last sentence. We said, Mr. President, we strongly advise you to widen the circle of your advisors beyond those clearly bent on a war for which we see no compelling reason, and from which we believe the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic. You know, we take no pleasure in having been right about that. It was the worst thing I've seen the United States in a war of aggression. I'll just finish by saying that that's a technical term, war of aggression, defined by Nuremberg as the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes only insofar as it contains the accumulated evil of the whole. Accumulated evil, think torture. I guess I should figure and say, I should say it. So our mission became the same as it always was. No falling off any horse on the way to Damascus. Tell the truth. And we got some real resonance for a couple of our first memos to the president. But since then, they shut us down. We still publish memos to the president. Some of them we believe get through, but there's no indication that he takes them seriously, and less still that he decides that he ought to follow our advice.
That's really, and you know, I'm sure that people that don't know some of those details really appreciate kind of being, because again, we've had the wool pulled over our eyes with another, you know, endless war that actually is profiting some of the same companies, Lockheed Martin, TRW, that is now gone, but you know, you have Raytheon and other ones. So, or they've been absorbed. TRW's been absorbed, so to speak. Reef, I know I saw that you had some comments and questions, and people are wanting to ask Ray some things. Do you have anything you want to ask, or?
Yeah, I got
audience?
one.
Okay.
Let's go to, yes, Russia is winning and our country has been lying to us. Will CNN and MSNBC viewers get that, or will they focus on a guy who committed espionage? That's the question.
Okay. What do you think, Ray?
Well,
What's the spin going to be now?
The classical diversion of attention, you know, who did it, who released this no attention to what this really means, to know not only that Russia's winning, but the counteroffensive so celebrated, so ballyhooed for months now ain't gonna happen. That it's the Ukrainians that are running out of ammunition, not the Russians. And so, the denouement is coming in just a couple of months, okay? In other words, the Russians are going to be able to go all the way west to the Dnieper River. And then I believe they'll stop and say, all right, how about now? How about now? Want to talk now? Or you want us to go all the way to the Polish border? My God, I hope that doesn't happen. I hope sane heads in Washington and a sane populace who is educated now, hopefully by virtue of these leaks, will say, look, let's cut our losses here. Let's tell this crazy Zelensky, not only can't you have Crimea back, but you got to make a deal with the Russians so that they don't feel threatened as they did before they invaded the Donbass.
Well, twice the peace talks have been blocked, even when Zelensky wanted them. So we know who's pulling the strings. That's the US and the UK through NATO. But my question to you is, regarding this whole quagmire, China now has come in and they've basically brokered a peace with Yemen. They helped bring the Saudis and Iran together. And now the result is Yemen is looking like there'll be a ceasefire that's long-standing, and they're moving towards peace and an alliance. China is also now trying to broker a peace between Ukraine and Russia, and Zelensky said publicly he was open to that. The U.S., that's when Kirby lost his mind on national television, saying there couldn't be a ceasefire, and was pushing back. I find it amusing they keep putting Kirby out there because he's not the most eloquent spokesperson for and you can tell when he's very agitated. So that was an interesting thing, but he almost went apoplectic in just describing why there shouldn't be a ceasefire. So do you think that the US is pulling the string? Because my analysis is Zelensky's not making any decisions at all. But what is your view on it? I could be wrong.
I agree. It's quite clear that Zelensky is a creature of what the people running our foreign policy want him to do. I used to say the president, but I think the president is out of it. I have no indication that he's really making the decisions.
Yeah.
Making decisions. I've been calling them sophomores. Jacob Sullivan.
Right.
Tony Blinken.
Right.
Victoria Nuland.
Vindman in the background and Michael McFaul. They're not directly, but they're behind.
So, the question really is, are these people sane?
Not Vindman, for sure. And not Blinken. Yeah.
There's a thin line between arrogance and sanity. Okay.
Right.
Let me explain.
Okay.
In the old analysis shop, watching Soviet leaders, we had a real strong discipline of reading everything they said, watching everything they said to the degree TV was up then, and digesting it and pointing it out and reporting on it. Now, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, at Valdai, the discussion club, at the end of October, he made a speech for 45 minutes, as he often does, and then we took Q&A for 3.5 more hours. Taken off the cuff, It was really quite an amazing performance. About halfway through, he gets a question. Mr. President, do you have any clues as to why the United States is picking a fight with China? At the same time, they're sending all kinds of arms and picking a fight with us in Ukraine. Putin. Doesn't make any logical sense, does it? I think they're just crazy. Sumashedshi is the Russian word. Out is mine. walking out of your mind, sumeshichi, okay, his word. Now, then he says, so this is important, he says, the only thing that can explain it is overweening arrogance and a feeling of impunity.
Yeah.
That describes these pink striped these people who are running our policy, who never really served in the army or never really served in any military thing, and so to think they're exceptional, think they're indispensable, and it ain't so. So now McGovern agrees with President Putin on this, and you can say that. I don't care who learns about that. They're crazy, okay? Now, it doesn't matter what McGovern agrees with or what McGovern thinks. It does matter what Putin and his military advisors think. I mean, crazy is about the worst thing that a potential enemy can be. You have to plan for the worst. And that's what gives me great pause. That's what gives me great anxiety, that the Russians cannot count on a sensible reaction to what's going on in Ukraine. And that's largely why they have China on board now in a virtual military alliance with a warning to the U.S. Look, you want a two-front war? And still, there's no evidence that Jacob Sullivan or Tony Blinken or Nolan, that they are even aware that this is the kind of thing they're getting the United States into and NATO. Now, one of the things about all these leaks just occurs to me is that Europe knows about the leaks too, okay? So here are the Germans and the French and everybody else being asked to pony up more tanks, pony up more ammunition and howitzers and so forth. And they see U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency says, at most, the good forces, the Ukrainian forces, can move maybe 20 miles if they do this offensive, and they might not do it at all, or they might do it next year. Hello, the thing is a fool's errand. It's become clear that that's the case. Now, let me just do an analogy between now and, I won't count the years, Vietnam. I mentioned that Walter Cronkite, the most respected reporter, said, we're going to cut tail. That was after the Tet Offensive, okay?
Right.
The Tet Offensive was a complete surprise. Why? Because General Westmoreland lied about how many enemy there were. I asked my fellow analysts in CIA, why would he lie about that? The generals at war usually exaggerate the number of enemies. He said, no, you got to understand, it's it's arithmetic. The score in Saigon is not real smart, but they do arithmetic, okay? And when you kill 350 Viet Cong every week, it mounts up. So they can't go over 299,000 troops. I mean, we've had people in Westmoreland's intelligence shop saying kiddingly, we've told Ho Chi Minh, no more. You can't plan any more, just 299,000. Anyhow, that's the force that was going on. And that's why Tet was such a major surprise. Now, what happened? Tet ended at the first week of February. I mentioned Walter Cronkite at the end of February. What happened in March? This is really interesting. What happened in March is that Westmoreland was pushing for Lyndon Johnson to send 206,000 more troops to Vietnam to broaden the war into Cambodia, Laos, North Vietnam, maybe as far as the Chinese border, okay? Now, there was a fellow in the Defense Department who knew all this. He was number 3 in the Defense Department. I'll tell you who his name is later. But he said, I better leak this because LBJ is going to approve this. And so he goes to the New York Times, Neil Sheehan and Rick Smith, and the New York Times on the 10th of March, 1968, publishes the fact that Westmoreland is asking for 260,000 more troops, okay? And that there's great dissension in the White House and the Pentagon. Should we do this or not? Okay. Then a very, very reputable person saw that leak and said, I'm going to leak the figures about the enemy's strength and show that Westmoreland was lying through his teeth. And that's why we lost so heavily at Tet. That fellow's name was Daniel Ellsberg.
Yep.
Now, we're talking 3 years before the Pentagon Papers. Nobody pretty much knows that that was Dan Ellsberg's first leak. But when you put his leak about the numbers and you put the Pentagon person's leak about the Westmoreland's plans, put them together, LBJ says 5 days later, we've lost all support for the war. The leaks to the New York Times really hurt us. I was going to give Westy the 260,000 troops, but now we've lost it. Nobody believes me anymore, and I'm not going to run for president again. End of March 1968. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that leaks of this kind can be very, very salutary. A nice little footnote is that the first leaker, the one who released the damaging leak that Westmoreland was asking for 260,000, we know that LBJ was going to give them to him. That was a fellow named Leslie Gelb. He was number 3 at the Pentagon, and just before he leaked, he had been appointed the head of the Pentagon Papers operation by McNamara. So
By McNamara, okay, gotcha.
So a very distinguished guy appointed by McNamara to do the Pentagon Papers thought it his patriotic duty to leak this, but he never told anybody. Dan Ellsberg pulled out his hair for years, couldn't find out who did it until Les Gelb died in 2019. Then Dan found out that it was Les. Now, why did Les keep that secret? Because he wanted to be distinguished. He was the president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was in very good odor when they put him 6 feet under, okay? And ain't worth it, folks. Leak now and be proud of it.
Interesting. That's so fascinating, that history. And I that brings me to your friend and the recent appearance at the UN Security Council, your friend Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, who brought to light the Nord Stream 2, obviously that America and Norway had colluded and had bombed this Nord Stream pipeline, which has ended up being one of the largest environmental damage. I mean, it was the largest release of methane, this explosion. You had U.S. officials, but right before it happened, saying it, pretty much predicting it was going to happen, that something was going to happen to it. Then it did. So you had a lot of circumstantial evidence, but he really brought forward, solidified evidence with his reporting. And then, of course, he was attacked. Even though he's a Pulitzer Prize winning, he was attacked by journalists currently who should be doing investigative reporting. And ignored. And then the New York Times did a hit piece, and then they tried to do a diversionary piece, if you will, and blame it again on Russia. Like, why would they blow up their own pipeline? And what people need to remember is that blowing up civilian infrastructure is a war crime, 1. 2, part of that pipeline was owned by Germany. So Norway and US essentially blew up their allies' access to natural gas. And that it's quite something that it's gone in and out of the headlines. But now Cy Hersh has written a couple follow-up articles, and most recently he's getting into the embezzlement, the money laundering that's happening in Ukraine. And Zelensky, I think it was 400 million, 400 million, and probably more. And then I've known some anecdotal reports of Zelensky's in his cabinet, them getting caught at the border with millions, of like a wife of one of the Ukraine officials. There's all kinds out there of. So I wanted you to comment on Seymour Hersh, your friend's reporting, but also what kind of prompted you then to speak before the UN Security Council and how that went.
Well, the Russians had made a proposal for an independent investigation of the sabotage of the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked Jeffrey Sachs, who's a professor at Columbia, and me to give a little briefing before the consideration before the Security Council. The date was February 21. So I had almost no notice on this, got on a plane that morning, got there on time. And when I got there, I realized that that very morning, a paper had been circulated among the members of the Security Council, and it said, we, Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, we got it covered. We're going to investigate this thing, or we're going to thorough, complete investigation. We don't need anything. Leave it to us. We got it covered. So when the Russians made a plea for an independent investigation, saying, look, what's the UN Security Council for if it can't investigate independently an act of war of this kind?
Right.
And the Chinese chimed in and said, you're right about that. And the Brazilians were kind of, saying, yeah, that makes some sense to us. Okay, well, what happened? Well, we briefed them on what we thought of the deal. And then that was the end of our testimony. And then there were several weeks went by. The proof is in the pudding here about what the UN Security Council has become. Just about 2 weeks ago now, the vote was taken. And when I read the press accounts, I said, oh, 3 votes for Russia, China, Brazil. Okay.
Right.
How many votes against? No votes against. 12 abstentions.
Right.
So, Tara, it was too embarrassing to vote against an independent investigation. So the US, Britain, and France had all their little vassals vote. We all abstained. A new record for abstentions. 12 of them. Actually, it ties an earlier record early this year. 3 for the investigation. That's not enough when you have 12 abstentions. So what does that tell you? I'll say one more thing, and that is this business about, leave it to us, we Germans and Danes and Swedes. The Swedes went down there and investigated them. They're pretty able people. They know every inch of the bottom of the sea down there. And they came up, in there. And people said, well, what'd you find? And the Swede said, we can't tell you. It's a secret. It would endanger national security. We're not even telling our own people. We can't tell you. Okay, so that happens, a week or two after the explosion in late September of last year. So now the UN Security Council is being asked to trust the Swedes, trust the Danes, trust the Germans, and we got it all covered. I'm going to do it,
Right. Yeah.
It was really interesting. You mentioned that it was pretty much forecast by our president. And when he said, we can do this, I promise you, we can end the Nord Stream pipeline. There was a very enterprising Reuters reporter, a woman. Nevertheless, she persisted, you might say. She turns to Chancellor Scholz, who's standing at the next podium, and she says, Herr Chancellor, was halten Sie davon? Mr. Chancellor, what do you think about that? He looks like he's caught in the headlights, and then he says, we do everything together. We don't do anything of any consequence that we don't do together. Now, I've been asking my journalist friends in Germany, have you asked Chancellor Scholz when he knew, what he knew. If he said we do it together, did Biden tell him on the 7th of February that this was his plan? Or were you completely überrascht? Were you completely surprised in September when the thing blew? They're afraid to ask the question. The Germans are so subservient to the United States still, 78 years after the end of the war, that they're afraid to ask these questions. Now, however, when it looks like the US official documents are admitting that Ukraine is a fool's errand in every sense of the word, well, will they put pressure? That is, the Germans will sit up and say, now, Chancellor Scholz, you're doubling our defense expenditures, and we have no gas to heat our homes or to run our industry. Do you think maybe you have a change of mind now? Well, I've been saying the Germans will grow up for many years now. They haven't yet. I guess there's always hope.
I don't know if there's hope. I mean, I think we're on the verge of nuclear war right now, and you have these European nations that are economically been ravaged, and they're all in for this conflict that's grinding on. And now you have Germany is much more strict with the people like myself. We're speaking out against this proxy war, right? Openly. I was one of the speakers at the Rage Against the War Machine in DC a few weeks ago. In 2 weeks, I'll be in New York City. I'll be at another summit or peace summit for No More Endless Wars, and I'll be speaking there. So there's a small group of us that are speaking out without too many consequences. But in Germany, I talked to Alina Lipp, who went to the Donbass, and all she did as a journalist was simply ask some people how they felt about Russia coming there. And the people in Donbass, of course, wanted Russia to come and gave this response. It aired on German television. She had to flee Germany because she was threatened with prison. Her bank account was sanctioned, and her parents. And so they criminalized speech. So yeah, Germany's different, and they are quite firmly in the pocket of NATO and US interests. Although
Scary.
This pipeline hurt their economy. So what is the logic behind some of these NATO countries being the vassals? And do you see, like you heard Macron about China backing away from Washington's kind of hawkish, pecking at China? What's your view? Do you think that Macron and others are going to start backing away now and not be such vassals, or are we just going to keep going towards the edge of this war?
Logical answer to that, Tara, is of course they should. There's a lot riding on relationships with China, economic relationships, especially for these West European countries. Mm-hmm. So it's not like they're going to have to follow every diktat that the U.S., acting through NATO usually, will tell them to do. So I think it'll be a more gradual process than I would like to see. Mm-hmm. But of course, Macron has de Gaulle as an example to follow. Mm-hmm. There is a degree of independence in France that one does not see in Germany. Right. And against that, you have the Poles, who would just as soon get into a fighting war with Russia. They don't have any sense at all. So right. You get really a big mishmash in the EC and in Europe as a whole. Mm-hmm. And I think probably that will work to the good, because it's really hard for me to say with these latest revelations that the U.S. will still be able to persuade. The U.S. will still be able to do what Westmoreland was trying to do in doubling down in Vietnam, in right. This case, doubling down in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And I know you have a cold, and I so appreciate that you came on. So I don't want to hold you too much longer, but I wanted just a couple of things just to get your final thoughts about the future for this Pentagon leaker, like what will happen to him from your view, just from knowing what you know about the CIA. And I wanted to bring in one more question from the audience. Reef, if you have something that someone wanted to ask. Yes. Now, yeah, mine can go last. And then okay. You're scrolling. You have several. So when you rewatch this, Ray, you can watch all the chat. And you can,
Okay.
see that.
That'll be instructive.
Yes. And then people, if you want to get a hold of Ray, you have a website. Maybe if people have questions, they can ask questions via email or something.
Yeah. When I do interviews like this, my son, who runs my website, really hits me hard if I don't mention it. And he says, Dad, RayMcGovern.com. And always add, if you don't get it. But I'm too modest to say, if you don't get it, you don't get it. So I usually leave that part off.
Good lead in for my question. They ask if you have any tips for how regular people survive this new digital oppression in the U.S. That's the question for you, Mr. Ray.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here you go. My recommendation is to not try to do this alone. You get together with 3 or 4 or 5 other people that you really trust, people who you really reliable, good friends who feel pretty much the way you do about what's happening in this country. And you meet every week, just for an hour, but you make that commitment. Now, the only other requirement is that there be at least one woman in each one of these groups, because it's the women, in my experience, that have all the guts and a lot of the imagination, okay? So you meet every week. Now, it takes a while, but after a few months, you will find that ideas spring up from this collegial atmosphere that none of you would have thought of all by yourself. And then when that happens, people support those ideas. People will question them, but once the support is ready, you can have support. And the other thing is that you also have accountability. If you say, I'm going to see AOC, or going to bang on her door next week, then the following week, when you all get together, you can expect these good friends to say, how'd it go? How'd it go with AOC? And it'd be a little embarrassing if you say, oh, well, I didn't follow through on that. So you have accountability, you have support, you have a group that won't quit if you do it every week, okay? And if you have at least one woman in there, you're going to start get really guts. You're going to have to have really good ideas. That's the way I would suggest you approach it. You're not going to change the world right away, but as Margaret Mead said, the only thing that really does change the world is this kind of small group of committed people.
Right. Well, on that note, I will let you get back to healing your cold. And I just want to say how much I appreciate you being here. Do you have any final thoughts? Just I kind of want to leave that, let you leave us with any final thoughts you have about what's happening right now.
I would say that this is the time to expose the lies, just as they were exposed on Vietnam when it became clear that the commander of U.S. forces there had lied through his teeth. There was no way that the Viet Cong could have wreaked the havoc that they did in late January, early February 1968 without 500, 600,000 troops, okay? He was exposed as a liar, and yet he was pushing for 206,000 more troops, okay? Now, those kind of lies are existing today with respect to Ukraine. And, Martin Luther King Jr., whose works I virtually commit to memory, whose works I use in every course that I teach. In his letter from the Birmingham City Jail, he said this, and this is not often quoted. He said, like a boil that can never be cured unless it is opened up with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, so too injustice and lying must be exposed with all the friction its exposure creates, the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion, before it can be cured. So that's all our job, okay? We got to expose this stuff, as distasteful and as controversial as it may be. We'll have best friends who just can't buy the fact that a general with 4 stripes is lying through his teeth, but he is, okay? So let's follow the dictate from Dr. King, and remember the other thing he said, and this is perhaps even more important. There is such a thing as too late. It's getting to be that time. Thanks for having me on, Tara.
Oh, thank you so much. It was beautiful to have you on. And to the audience, I want to thank you so much for joining us live. I know some of you came really early, so I appreciate that. And you can also watch this again on Rumble, YouTube, and all the different platforms, and Twitter as well, I believe. But I think for rewatching, you can do that. And then you can find me in 2 weeks. I'll be in Manhattan. I'll be in New York City. Actually, next weekend. What am I saying? Next weekend, April 22nd, from 1 to 5, I'll be moderating a panel. We'll be talking about world peace with Diane Sayre, the Senate candidate who is running against Kristen Gillibrand, stopping these endless wars. And, you know, Reeve, I didn't ask you this before the show, but do you happen to have that poster ready there? I'll be speaking with at that event with Scott Ritter, Diane Sayre, and many other luminaries. I believe the Libertarian Party will be there, and also the People's Party. So people from all different political backgrounds. I'm an independent, as everyone knows. So please join me next week, and thank you for joining tonight. And thank you, Ray McGovern. It was really wonderful to see you. Good night, everyone.